Have you ever wondered what goes through a child's mind when the cold cuts through their skin, and the world doesn't seem to see them? Imagine walking through the icy streets in a thin, torn blouse, feeling the wind blow through every strand of clothing as the people around look away, or worse, they point, laugh, judge. This is the story of an orphan girl, only 9 years old, facing the winter alone, with no one to protect her from the cold or cruel words. In the midst of so many indifferent looks, a scene emerges that no one in the small bakery would ever forget. After all, when evil manifests itself in public, the unexpected can also happen. And have you ever lived a time when the judgment of others seemed to be the most difficult weight to carry? If this story has already touched your heart like the video, subscribe to the channel and come with me, because what happens next will surprise you. Winter in that city seemed crueler than ever. The wind howled through the narrow streets, sweeping away dry leaves and kicking up small swirls of snow that danced in the icy air. The sky, heavy and grey, seemed to accompany the gloomy silence that hung over the empty sidewalks. There, among the hurried movement of a few people huddled in their thick coats, walked a girl of only 9 years old. Her steps were small, almost hesitant, as if each one demanded from her a strength that almost no longer existed. The slippery ground under his barely protected feet and the biting air on his delicate face turned every meter he traveled into a challenge. She wore a thin blouse, with the sleeves ripped and the shoulders exposed. The fabric, worn out by time and hardship, offered no resistance to the cold that pierced her skin like needles. Her lips were purplish, cracked by the merciless wind. His nose, red and swollen, betrayed the hours he had already spent facing that relentless climate. Her hair, unkempt and dirty, swayed with the gusts of wind that seemed to mock her fragility. His hands, curled up inside his short sleeves, trembled uncontrollably, in a futile attempt to conserve some warmth. Ever since she had lost her parents, the girl had wandered the streets of that big city, where almost no one noticed her presence. Or maybe they did, but preferred to ignore it. The indifference of the people was almost as cold as the winter that punished her. In the midst of so many hurried faces, no gaze was fixed on her for more than a few seconds. No one saw the child alone, lost, hungry, and exposed to a loneliness that no adult could endure for so long. The abandonment that accompanied her was not only physical, it was the absence of a hug, a lap, a sweet word. It was the emptiness of the days when there was not even the hope of finding a safe place, and even when she managed to take shelter in some improvised corner, the cold always found her, invading cracks and tiny spaces, reminding her that her fight was not over yet. Tattoo streets were familiar to him, but not by choice. Each corner told a small part of its history of resistance. Every alley, every empty square, every illuminated window contrasting with the darkness of his life. She passed in front of shops filled with warm coats, of people smiling around coffee tables, of families gathered at cozy dinners, while her empty stomach growled and her shrunken body begged for some warmth. His toes ached inside his punctured shoes, already damp from the snow that was slowly melting. Each breath of wind seemed to pierce his soul, taking with it some more of the little energy that was left. Time seemed to drag on, and the cold, which was no longer just a sensation, became a constant, heavy, almost suffocating presence. The girl continued walking, looking with large and tired eyes at the gleaming windows. Christmas lights began to be set up around the city, contrasting with the sadness it carried. In every blink of colored light, there seemed to be a cruel irony, as if the world celebrated human warmth as she, so small and helpless, faced the icy clutches of that merciless station alone. At times, her knees gave way slightly, forcing her to stop for a few seconds to regain her balance. The frail body was fighting against the numbness caused by the low temperature, and yet there was something in his eyes that resisted, a small flame of hope that, even faint, refused to go out. The loneliness that enveloped her was almost palpable. There was not a hand to hold her, a voice to guide her, a smile to welcome her, only the sound of the footsteps of unknown people, the distant noise of cars, and the constant whistling of the biting wind. It was as if the whole world had moved, away, leaving her invisible in the midst of the indifferent movement of the city. Even so, she kept going, because stopping meant surrendering, and she had already learned that, in order to survive, it was necessary to keep walking. Each step taken was a challenge overcome, a small victory against that adverse scenario that seemed to want to consume her. With no certain destination, the girl's eyes searched for a corner where she could, at least for a few minutes, escape. The icy torture that invaded her bones. There was no shelter. There was no home. Just the silent hope that somewhere, maybe someone would reach out. She knew that asking for help often resulted in disapproving looks, abrupt withdrawals, harsh words that hurt as much as the cold. At that moment, his gaze stopped on a small bakery on the corner. The window pane was slightly blurred by the contrast of the heat inside and the cold outside. Inside, people chatted animatedly, drinking coffee, eating warm bread, surrounded by a cozy atmosphere that seemed to belong to another world, completely distant from the reality she knew, without thinking. Too much. Moved by the urgent need to warm herself, the girl slowly pushed the glass door. The little bell at the top of the door tinkled gently, attracting some curious glances. The heat escaping from the interior of the bakery enveloped his face like an unexpected embrace, awakening an almost forgotten feeling of comfort. She entered, slowly, trying not to attract attention, positioning herself discreetly near a corner of the wall. I just wanted to stay there, soak up some of that warmth, while watching the movements of the people around. His eyes shone discreetly before the sweets on display, the batches of freshly baked bread, the fumes rising from the steaming cups. But her presence did not go unnoticed for long. Some looks began to lengthen, the expressions changed. Whispers appeared, accompanied by judgmental looks that swept his body from top to bottom. The contrast between the girl's tattered clothes and the cozy atmosphere of the bakery was too visible to be ignored by those who prefer to point their finger rather than extend their hand. Now I want to know from you, which city are you watching from? Write there in the comments, and of course don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to follow every detail of this exciting story. The warmth of the bakery enveloped her immediately, almost as if it were an unexpected hug in the midst of the long journey of abandonment and cold she had been facing. The heated air contrasted with the icy wind outside, making her cheeks sting slightly, while small drops of water dripped from her damp hair of melting snow. For a few moments she remained motionless, feeling her body relax as if she were in a forbidden place, but at the same time welcoming. His eyes wandered discreetly through the room. The tables are occupied by families chatting animatedly, the couples sharing sweets fresh out of the oven, the children in warm and colorful clothes devouring generous pieces of cake. All that formed a scene of comfort and security that seemed to belong to another reality, far from his own. Positioned in a corner near the door, she shrank even more, almost wishing she was invisible so she could enjoy that warmth for as long as possible. The torn blouse no longer protected anything, but there, inside that heated space, the sharp air outside finally didn't reach her. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm breads filled his lungs, awakening a kind of simple and almost forgotten pleasure. His stomach, which until then had remained silent in the constant fight against hunger, began to manifest itself, emitting a slight rumble. She lowered her head, trying not to attract attention. However, in that environment of comfort of others, his presence quickly began to be noticed. Some looks, at first curious, turned into long looks, full of judgment. It was as if, for many there, their mere existence within that place was a kind of unwanted invasion. Discreet murmurs began to emerge between the tables, whispers that tried to be contained, but that escaped in the smiles at the corner of her mouth, in the arched eyebrows, in the eyes that accompanied her insistently. An elegantly dressed lady whispered something to the man next to her, who soon looked in the girl's direction with an air of reproach. At another table, two young men laughed muffled as they watched the state of her clothes, her scruffy hair, her worn-out shoes barely covering her small, cold red feet. Each silent comment was like a small needle in his already fragile confidence. She knew what those looks were saying, even without hearing the full words. It was the same judgment that I found in so many other places. They did not need to shout for the humiliation to be present. The contempt in the eyes, the subtle raising of the chin, the instinctive distancing from the bodies was enough, as if their simple proximity could contaminate that environment of comfort and abundance. Despite the growing discomfort, the girl did not dare to leave. The warmth of that space was his only defense against the brutal cold outside. As much as the eyes burned and made her want to disappear, the alternative of returning to the icy streets seemed even more cruel. His eyes avoided directly meeting anyone else's. He kept his gaze down, fixed on the well-kept wooden floor, while discreetly moving the fingers of his hands curled up in the sleeves, trying to re-warm his chilled body a little more. Time seemed to slow down inside the bakery. Every minute there was a mixture of physical relief and emotional discomfort. The constant noise of other people's conversations filled the air, but she heard only her own thoughts, thoughts that revolved around the constant doubt. How long could she stay before being expelled? Would anyone bother to the point of sending her away? Would there be anyone there who could see beyond the torn clothes, beyond the dirty and abandoned appearance? As he stood there, motionless, he noticed that the looks were starting to become even more insistent. Small gestures of reproach appeared. A man grumbled softly, crossing his arms as if bothered by her presence. A mother discreetly pulled her son closer, as if the mere proximity to that child could represent some danger. The girl shrugged, feeling the invisible weight of that collective disapproval. Even so, there was a spark of hope lit inside her, almost imperceptible. Something that made her resist and stay there, even in the face of the invisible pressure that tried to push her back into the cold. That hope had no form, but it was what gave him the strength to keep breathing, even on the hardest days. Perhaps deep down he believed that at some point, someone would finally see beyond the dirt and misery. On the other side of the room, sitting next to the large window overlooking the snow-covered street, a man watched the scene in silence. While many looked away, he remained attentive to every detail. His eyes followed the girl's shy movements. They noticed the way she avoided eye contact, how she tried to be invisible while fighting for a few minutes of heat. At the same time, he observed the faces around him, the expressions charged with judgment and coldness. The girl, unaware that she was being carefully watched, kept her head down, as if wishing to disappear into the wall. The discomfort was visible, in his hunched posture, in the half-closed eyes, in the nervous tightening of his own arms against his chest. Each new muffled laugh sounded like a blow. Each whisper fed the feeling of not belonging even more. Outside, snowflakes continued to fall, thick and slow, covering the roofs and sidewalks with a white blanket. The contrast between the outside and inside of the bakery was almost cruel. While the world froze outside, inside reigned a warmth that seemed denied to her not only physically but emotionally. It was as if fate itself always kept her on the wrong side of the door. Even in the face of all the discomfort, she resisted. After all, the street outside didn't even offer humiliation. It offered only the icy emptiness of the night, the relentless loneliness, and the constant fear of what might happen at every deserted corner. Staying in that corner of the bakery, despite the accusing looks, was still for now his best chance to face the winter. Without raising her head but feeling the weight of the looks, she knew that the tension within the environment was growing. She could almost hear the sound of unspoken criticism. She could almost predict that at any moment, someone would rise up to confront her directly. What she didn't know was that, at that moment, something began to change around her, discreetly, without her noticing. And while the snow continued to fall outside, fate was already preparing an unexpected movement. The voices, previously whispered, began to take on a different tone. It was no longer just quick glances or discreet whispers. Now the words dragged through the hot air of the bakery like invisible knives, cutting off what little courage the girl had left. The first sentences carried that contempt typical of those who observe from afar, as if misery had been borne by choice. They watched her, as if analyzing something out of place, an anomaly in the midst of the comfortable scenario. The whispers, still timid, soon evolved into mean comments, loaded with insensitivity and superiority. Some people spoke softly but purposely loud enough that their words hit who they were supposed to hit. Eyes crossed, accompanied by small muffled laughter, creating a network of judgment that enveloped the girl on all sides. They said with the coldness of those who had never known pain, phrases that seemed common to them, but that pierced the soul of that child. They questioned the state of their clothes, insinuated their dirt, questioned their origin as if it were the result of something undesirable and far from any human understanding. The faces of the people in the bakery turned into expressions of disdain and arrogance. For many there, it was nothing more than a social problem that momentarily invaded their comfortable environment, as if her presence spoiled the taste of the coffee, as if the warmth she so innocently sought could steal the comfort of others. And even though no one had invited her, the mere fact of trying to warm up seemed like an unforgivable audacity. The cruel words began to echo even louder, hitting the girl with the force of a storm. It was not only the cold of the street that chilled her skin, but the cold of the people who now surrounded her, with their merciless judgment. The comments seemed to multiply around her, as if each person there felt the need to give their own sentence on that child. They questioned where her parents were, insinuated that they probably didn't even exist, and did so with a tone of contempt that only added to the shame she felt. The girl's face began to turn red, but not from the freshly conquered warmth of the bakery. It was shame burning inside, like a flame rising from her stomach to her cheeks. His eyes, large and full of an old sadness, began to teary. Tears threatened to flow, betraying her vulnerability, but she, with surprising strength for someone so young, fought to keep them trapped. Every muscle in her face trembled in an attempt to hide her tears, for she had already learned that crying often only fueled the cruelty of others even more. Her breath became shorter, as if the very air of the bakery now rejected her as well. Her chest rose and fell in small contained sobs, while she kept her eyes fixed on the floor. The shame was suffocating. She felt her whole body shrink involuntarily, as if it wanted to disappear right there, merge with the wall, become truly invisible. The dignity he was still trying to preserve seemed to slowly drain away, like the melting snow that stained his punctured shoes. Despite being so young, that girl already knew well the weight of contempt. It wasn't the first time she had faced looks like this, nor would it be the last. Ever since she lost her parents, the streets had taught her hard lessons about human indifference. But in that instant, surrounded by adults who were supposed to be examples of compassion and kindness, the cruelty took on an even heavier form. It was not the abandonment of the street, but the cold judgment of those who, even with everything, preferred to point the finger instead of extending a hand. She knew she couldn't stay there for long. As much as the warmth of the bakery was the only relief from the winter outside, the weight of contempt pushed her, little by little, towards the door. Every second seemed harder than the last. It was like carrying an invisible burden where fear, shame, and sadness mingled in a maelstrom that threatened to collapse at any moment. The conversations continued, now mixed with small laughs and complicit looks between some customers. Each new word spoken was heavier than the previous one, forming a chorus of indifference disguised as superiority. It was as if everyone there shared a silent thought. She doesn't belong here. The girl felt the weight of these unspoken words, with the force of a scream. Each comment was a hammer blow to his already fragile emotional resistance. Even so, she fought the urge to run. His feet remained planted in the same place, as if there was still hope that perhaps someone would have the courage to look beyond his appearance and see, in fact, the frightened and lonely child who trembled before them. But the looks remained relentless. She didn't see compassion, she didn't see understanding, just coldness. With a small movement of her head, she could see out of the corner of her eyes another customer making a discreet gesture of disapproval, as if mentally questioning who would allow a child like that within such a respectable environment. Another needle, another invisible wound that would be stored in his memory for a long time. Every little trial there seemed to scream that she had no right to even heat. The minutes ticked slowly, as the buzz of criticism swelled like a rising tide unchecked. The girl's hands trembled even more, not only from the cold now, but from the anxiety that was beginning to overwhelm her. The desire to disappear became almost unbearable. The shame of being the target of so many stares consumed her inside, eroding the little strength that was still left in her fragile body. Finally, as if in a protective instinct, the girl began to turn slowly toward the door. The warmth of the bakery, which had once felt like a temporary shelter, was now overwhelming, not because of the heat itself, but because of the hostile environment that surrounded her. It was as if the very air was charged with contempt, forcing her to seek the cold outside, which at least did not judge her. His steps were short and uncertain. His hunched body tried to hide his face, but shame burned in every pore. As he walked towards the exit, he felt the gazes still locked on his back. He knew that as soon as he crossed the door, the comments would start again, now with the relief of someone who finally got rid of the discomfort that his presence represented. Still, she continued, determined not to allow the tears, which were now struggling to come out, to be seen by those who did not deserve to see them. The snow kept falling outside, as if the winter had no end. But unbeknownst to the girl, as the gazes pushed her into the cold once again, something was about to happen inside that bakery. Something that would change not only that moment, but the entire course of its history. As the girl took her first steps towards the door, dragging the weight of that silent humiliation with her, the air inside the bakery seemed to grow even thicker. The heat, which once welcomed her, now pushed her. Her eyes, still moist, remained fixed on the ground, as if they wanted to avoid the last blow of the glances that accompanied her on her way out. It was a short journey, a few meters to reach the glass door, but the distance seemed endless, crossed by an invisible road of judgments and contempt. His hands, tucked into the torn sleeves of his blouse, trembled in sync with his faltering steps. The pain she felt was no longer just physical, but a knot that tightened her chest, a knot formed by years of loss, by the cold streets, by empty nights, and now by those whispered voices, loaded with evil. Every sentence spoken behind her seemed engraved, like marks that would be stuck in her memory indefinitely. The abandonment of the streets, however brutal, had never been so cruel as the contempt of comfortably warmed people. But before his hand could reach the cold doorknob, the steady, unexpected sound of a voice filled the space, as if tearing through the silence laden with hypocrisy and judgment. The voice did not come with screams nor with aggressiveness. It was a serene, controlled tone, but loaded with authority. And precisely for this reason, he silenced all the others. Clear words echoed in the room, cutting through the oppressive atmosphere of the bakery like a sharp blade through the dense air. There was no need for high volume for everyone to hear. In that simple sentence, there was a weight that no one could ignore. The conversations ceased instantly. The gazes, which until then had been fixed on the girl, turned in sync to the origin of that unexpected voice. There, in the corner of the bakery, sitting alone at a table near the large window, was the man who had remained silent until that moment. Her discreet presence had not attracted attention before, but now it seemed to dominate the entire environment. He maintained a calm, unhurried posture, like someone who knows exactly what needs to be said and done. His eyes, fixed on the faces of those who minutes before had mocked the child, carried something rare, firmness and compassion in equal measure. It was a look that didn't ask permission to exist, that didn't need to raise the tone to be respected. The words that came out of his mouth were as direct as they were disconcerting to those who were there. Suddenly the atmosphere of the bakery was transformed. The discomfort that was once only the girl's now hovered over everyone present. Some of the customers quickly lowered their eyes, trying to escape the silent reproach that came from this man. Others shifted restlessly in their chairs, trying to disguise the shame that, little by little, began to take the place of mockery. The hands that had previously held cups of coffee trembled slightly, the fingers drummed nervously on the edges of the tables, and the conversation ceased altogether. For the first time since the girl's arrival, the silence in the bakery was absolute. The girl, surprised and confused, interrupted her outward movement. His body, still shivering with cold and excitement, remained motionless, while his eyes discreetly turned towards that unknown figure. There was something different about that man, not only in his posture but in the way he faced it. There was no contempt, there was no judgment, just a strange, powerful calm that somehow broke through the barrier of fear that enveloped her. He stood up with the same tranquility with which he had spoken. His movement was slow, but loaded with intent. There was no hurry in his gestures, as if he wanted to give everyone the time they needed to digest their own attitudes. As he walked towards the girl, the silence remained absolute. The sound of his footsteps on the wooden floor sounded loud in that quiet environment. Each beat of his shoes seemed to mark the rhythm of something that was about to change. The eyes of the customers followed him, now mixed between discomfort and curiosity. Who was that man? Why had he stood up? What would I do now? No one knew, but everyone in some way felt that this moment was different from everything they had witnessed there. Even the bakery's employees, previously busy with their appointments, were now motionless, watching every move closely. When the man finally stopped in front of the girl, his presence seemed to form a kind of invisible shield around her. For the first time in a long time, she did not feel alone in the face of the cruelty of others. The weight of the looks was still there, but there was something bigger filling the space. The feeling that someone, at last, saw her. Not as a problem, not as a nuisance, but as a child. A child who needed help, not judgment. Without the need for grandiose words, the man maintained the same serene and calm tone, addressing only her. His posture was welcoming but firm. The way her eyes watched her conveyed a silent message of security, something the girl almost didn't believe existed. He did not look at her with pity, nor with superiority. There was a sincere respect there, something rare in his entire journey through the cold streets of the city. The girl, still confused, kept her eyes fixed on the stranger's face. For a moment she felt the tears return, no longer as a result of shame, but as an unexpected reaction to the breaking of that loneliness that had accompanied her for so long. The tears threatened to fall again, but this time mixed with something new, a faint thread of relief. There was, in short, someone who did not look away, someone who did not see in his presence an affront. Behind them, the rest of the customers remained motionless, plunged into the discomfort of their own consciences. The words spoken earlier echoed in their minds like uncomfortable mirrors. The small evils, the comments disguised as humor, now gained a different weight in the face of that man's intervention. Some began to look away again, others watched with a mixture of regret and restlessness. The presence of this stranger had interrupted the usual cycle of indifference, and now everyone was forced to face their own behavior. The air inside the bakery was still heavy, but in a different way. It was no longer the weight of humiliation on the girl, but the weight of collective shame that hung over those who had previously laughed and mocked. And in the center of it all, that unknown figure stood solid before the child, like a wall that had risen between her and the wickedness that tried to suffocate her. As the snow continued to fall outside, at that very moment, the course of that story was just beginning to change. Silence still dominated the environment, but now loaded with a different weight. The girl's eyes, shy and confused, rose slowly, meeting the calm gaze of that man who, until a few moments, was just another face in the midst of the indifferent crowd. There in front of her there was no judgment, no haste, no fear. There was only a firm presence and a silent invitation for his story, so often ignored, to finally be heard. For the first time in a long time, she felt that someone really wanted to listen, without accusations, without suspicion, without prejudice. Just listen. The words began to leave her lips hesitantly, as if each one needed to cross an invisible barrier of accumulated pain. His voice was weak, almost a whisper, carried by the fatigue and fragility of someone who learned too soon to suffocate his own suffering. Even so, she found the strength to tell it, not because he wanted to relive every detail, but because in that rare instant, someone finally cared enough to listen. With her breathing still unsteady, she revealed how her life had changed abruptly and cruelly 2 years ago. Her parents, who were her only safe haven, had suddenly left, taken by an accident that destroyed not only the structure of her family, but also any reference of home, protection, or love. From that day on, everything he knew as childhood was ripped away without warning, replaced by a cold, unforgiving, and indifferent world. With no close family members, no one who could reach out, she began to wander the streets. At first, he sought shelter in the doors of buildings, on benches in squares, in train stations where the heat of the machines softened the cold at night. He learned to survive with the little that chance offered him. Leftover food, clothes found in donation bags or abandoned on the sidewalks, small bits of sporadic kindness from strangers who, for a brief moment, saw the pain behind those big, tired eyes. Winter, however, has always been his greatest enemy. Each passing year seemed more severe, as if the cold tested the limits of his endurance. The fingers and toes, constantly frozen, had already lost some of their sensitivity. The Saiju torn clothes she wore were not the result of choice, but the result of a slow daily wear and tear, of those who have no other fabric to wear. Each thin layer of cloth tried in vain to stop the biting wind that pierced its small defenses. Between one story and another, small sobs escaped, but she insisted on continuing, determined to share her story with this unknown man. He spoke of the nights spent in dark corners of the city, where fear came not only from the cold, but also from the shadows and invisible dangers that surrounded the helpless. He spoke of the days when hunger was so tight that his stomach ached as if he were devouring himself inside. He spoke of the mornings when he woke up with his eyes glued to the cold, his body aching from sleeping on hard and damp sidewalks. With each word spoken, the atmosphere of the bakery was changing. Gradually, the clients who had previously been so secure in their judgments began to lower their eyes even more, unable to sustain the weight of that raw and painful truth. That was not the story of a simple street girl, as they preferred to believe. It was the living portrait of a stolen childhood, of a daily struggle for survival in a world that has always ignored it. The man before her stood motionless, but attentive, to every detail, as if absorbing every word with his heart, not just his ears. His eyes, steady at first, began to tear discreetly. There was no theatricality in his emotion. It was a true compassion, of someone who sees the human being behind. The appearance of someone who recognizes the depth of pain without having to live it to understand it. He did not interrupt her at any time. He just listened, letting the silence between the words be filled by the gravity of what was being told. Each pause in the girl's speech carried meanings that words could not translate. They were moments of contained pain, of memories that still burned, of a loneliness difficult to describe. As she spoke, the tears she had once feared to shed began to fall silently, streaming down her pale cheeks and discreetly staining the worn fabric of her blouse. There was no screaming, there was no despair, just the silent cry of someone who has cried so many times alone that she has learned to do it in silence. The man, even seeing the tears, did not rush to console her with empty words. I knew that often the greatest comfort lies in simply allowing the pain to find its way out. Around them, the environment remained suspended. None of the others present dared to make any sound. That moment no longer belonged to them. Now it was only between the girl and that stranger who, unexpectedly, had become the first to offer her more than indifference. The rest of the people watched as spectators of a story that they never wanted to see, but that was now impossible for them to ignore. As the girl continued, the strength of her narrative made it increasingly clear how resilient she had been. He was not just an abandoned child, as so many prefer to label. She was a silent warrior who faced abandonment, cold, hunger, and fear on a daily basis, sustained only by an almost invisible but still pulsating hope that one day someone would truly see her. Even in the midst of misery, he had found ways to survive. He had learned where to look for crumbs of food, how to protect himself from the dangers of the night, and whom to avoid in the deserted streets. He carried with him invisible marks of trauma and pain that shaped his small existence. But even so, he was there, standing, still able to tell his story. As he listened to every word, the man in front of him saw much more than a dirty, hungry girl. I saw courage. I saw strength. I saw a humanity that so often goes unnoticed in the midst of the rush and daily insensitivity. It was impossible not to be moved by that raw sincerity, that pain exposed with such purity. And so, in that small space of the bakery, in the midst of the heat of the environment and the cold that hit outside, something rare was formed. A true connection between two worlds that, until then, had never intersected. The girl, without realizing it, began to feel something that she no longer knew how to recognize: security. The words still echoed quietly, but they were already accompanied by small breaths of relief. There was pain in each report, but also a certain relief in finally being heard. As if by sharing the weight of her story with that unknown man, she could finally release some of the burden she had been carrying alone for so long. Around him, the rest of the bakery was plunged into silence, but the air seemed different, charged with an emotional tension that everyone felt even without words. Judgment had dissolved, replaced by the shame of those who realized how wrong they had been in their quick and cruel assumptions. There, in that delicate and emotionally charged moment, something was just beginning to transform. The air in the bakery still remained dense, charged with the raw emotion that had taken over the environment since the moment the girl began to tell her story. But in the midst of that weight, a subtle thread of hope began to be born. The man, in front of him, who had listened to every word with the attention of one who recognizes the depth of the pain of others, took a small step forward. Her gestures were firm, but loaded with an unusual delicacy, like someone dealing with something fragile which for so long had to protect itself. Without hesitation, he reached out, offering not just a physical gesture, but something much greater: security, welcoming, trust. The girl looked at that open hand in front of her with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. She was not used to touches of care. For so long his life had been marked by distances and retreats, and now, in front of that stranger, something appeared that she almost didn't know how to process anymore. A pure gesture of kindness. Slowly, still suspiciously, her small icy hands came out of the torn sleeves of her blouse and touched the outstretched hand. The warmth she felt in that simple contact was more comforting than any blanket could offer. With slow but determined steps, the man led her out of the bakery. The people, now silent and ashamed, just watched the scene, unable to take their eyes off the stark contrast between the contempt they had shown minutes before and the unexpected gesture of compassion they now witnessed. Outside, the cold was still cruel. The wind kept cutting through the skin, and the snowflakes continued to fall. But something inside the girl began to warm up differently. It was not the body that was now reacting, but the heart, which for the first time in a long time felt the weight of loneliness lessen. They walked a few blocks, crossing streets lit by Christmas windows that flashed in warm and festive tones. The city, in its indifferent rush, followed its own rhythm. But for that girl, time seemed to slow down. Every step she took by that man's side was a step that distanced her from the recent pain of the bakery, the heavy judgments and the sharp looks. It was like finally crossing the invisible border that had separated her from the welcoming world she had always observed from a distance. Soon, they arrived at a clothing store. The heat, escaping from the automatic doors, enveloped them as they entered. There, under the soft, cozy lighting, hung thick coats, fluffy gloves, colorful caps, and sturdy boots, all gleaming in carefully arranged display cases. For a moment, the girl hesitated as she stepped into that space so different from her reality. Each piece hanging seemed like an unattainable luxury, as if they were not made for someone like her. But the man, with his constant calmness, guided her to the macaws, choosing each piece with attention and affection. Without question, he was sorting out quilted coats, fuzzy socks, warm gloves, a thick wool beanie, and waterproof boots. Each choice seemed carefully thought out, as if in every detail he silently said she deserved the best. As the pieces were accumulating in her arms, the girl watched everything with a contained sparkle in her eyes. It was like living something unreal, a dream she had never dared to dream. The store attendants, realizing what was happening, maintained a respectful and attentive posture, discreetly following that unusual gesture that, in some way, also touched them. No judgmental look, no cross-comment, just the silent presence in front of the discreet beauty of an act of pure kindness. The girl, now dressed in the new thick coat, the soft gloves warming her previously dormant fingers and her feet, shod in firm boots, looked different, not only in appearance, but in the way he began to support his own body more firmly, as if the simple physical comfort was, little by little, also rebuilding his self-esteem that had been crushed for so long. They left the store in the same cold. That persisted outside, but now the wind seemed less aggressive. The blasts that once pierced her skin like knives were now blocked by the layers of warm fabric that enveloped her. Each step was a physical and emotional relief. For the first time in months, perhaps years, the cold didn't hurt her. She felt protected, wrapped in a hug that came not only from her clothes, but from the generous attitude of that man who was still by her side. They continued walking until they came to a small restaurant with a simple but welcoming facade. The hot steam escaped through the doors as they opened, bringing the delicious aroma of fresh food, a smell that the girl only knew from afar on the sidewalks of the busy streets. His eyes, now a little more open, absorbed every detail of that new scenario. The polished wooden tables, the checkered tablecloths, the soft sound of ambient music. It was a simple place, but for her, loaded with an almost magical charm. They sat down at the table, and soon the waiter, polite and kind, brought the menu. She, still frightened by the abundance of options, remained silent, but the man didn't pressure her. He asked for it, choosing a hot, nutritious and filling dish, accompanied by juice and fresh bread. When the plate arrived, the girl's eyes almost widened. In front of him rested a meal such as he had not seen in a long time. Rice, colorful vegetables, soft steaming meat, all served with care. The first spoonfuls were careful, as if she feared that at any moment someone might tear it away from her. But as she realized that the plate belonged to her, that it would not be removed from there, she began to eat more willingly. Each bite felt like a gift, a relief not just to the empty stomach but to the weary soul. The warmth of the food, the taste of the food, the touch of her hands warmed by the gloves, all contributed to a sense of security that she hardly knew how to process. The man watched everything with a discreet smile, pleased to see her little by little, allowing herself to feel again what was cared for, what was dignity. They didn't need words. The mere fact that they were there said enough. For the first time in a long time, that girl experienced something that many take for granted, the basic right to feel welcomed, to be treated with respect, and to have her dignity returned. As she ate, the girl's gaze wandered around the room, watching the other people gathered there, families smiling, couples talking, friends laughing. Everything still seemed distant, as if it belonged to another world, but now no longer unattainable. It was as if, finally, a small bridge had been built between her previous reality and that universe of affection and normality. The meal went on quietly. The heat of the restaurant enveloped both, creating an even stronger contrast with the cold night that remained outside. The soft lights reflected off her face, now a little more flushed, as the steam from the food slowly rose from the table. And at that moment, without haste, without unnecessary words, something precious and rare was born, the real possibility of a new beginning. As the girl finished her meal, each bite seemed to carry the flavor not only of the food, but of something much deeper, the taste of a hope that was reborn. The expression on his face began to soften, as if, for the first time in a long time, body and soul could breathe together. The man in front of him, watching in silence, felt that this small gesture of kindness, however simple, had already planted a much larger seed. But within him, there was a growing unease. Something told him that he could not stop there. That girl was just one face among many who daily faced the same cold streets, the same abandonment, the same indifference. That night, as he walked back home, the man felt the weight of the story he had heard hours earlier. Every detail the girl had shared seemed to echo inside her mind, like a call impossible to ignore. When he arrived, he sat down in front of the computer, still enveloped by the emotions of the recent meeting. Without a script, without a rehearsal, she opened her social networks and, with sincere words, began to write. It was not a far-fetched text. There were no adornments or exaggerations. It was the raw truth, told exactly as he had heard it. He described the image of the 9-year-old girl entering the bakery with torn clothes, trying to keep warm. She recounted the cruel looks that enveloped her, the mean words whispered around her, and the weight of humiliation that almost made her give up and return to the cold of the streets. But mainly, he told about the courage of that child to continue, about his story of loss, about the strength with which he fought daily for survival, even in the face of so much adversity. He also shared the small gesture of reaching out and taking it to buy warm clothes, to offer a decent meal. He did not write to show off, but to provoke reflection, to wake up. What began as a simple personal account quickly gained traction. Actually, the first few minutes, some likes and comments appeared, but in a few hours, the story was already starting to cross the screen of his closest friends and reach unknown people. The honest words touched something deep in those who read them. It wasn't just a girl's story. It was the portrait of a larger problem, common to so many cities, so many streets, so many indifferent looks. At dawn, what he didn't expect began to happen. Hundreds of shares multiplied, taking the story beyond known circles. People started writing in the comments offering help. There were those who wanted to donate clothes, others offering food, some willing to contribute financially, and many asking how they could do something similar in their own cities. The commotion that took shape went beyond what was expected, like a wave that silently grows and suddenly invades the banks with overwhelming force. The news did not take long to overcome the barriers of social networks. Soon, a small local television station became aware of the publication and got in touch. Interested in knowing more about the girl's story and the unexpected gesture of that man, they decided to do a report. The cameras captured not only his emotional account, but also the shy smile of the girl, now protected from the cold with her new clothes. It was no longer just a story of tragedy, but of transformation. The report was aired and quickly went viral. Other larger broadcasters started to reproduce the content. News sites addressed the case. Columnists wrote articles reflecting on social neglect and the importance of small individual actions. In a matter of days, the name of that girl, previously invisible, became known to thousands of people who had never seen her, but who were now touched by her story of struggle. The impact of the commotion began to overflow the borders of that city. From neighboring municipalities, messages arrived from people inspired by the man's attitude. Solidarity campaigns began to sprout in other communities. Groups of volunteers organized themselves to help children in similar situations. Charitable organizations, churches and schools began to collect warm clothes, food, and funds to distribute among those who needed it most. The current of solidarity spread like fire in dry straw, carried by the strength of a simple but powerful example. The man, who at first only reached out to a single child, now found himself facing something much greater than he could have imagined. The movement that had been born from that cold night gained body and structure. Unknown people came to him wanting to collaborate, local companies offered support, and professionals from different areas were willing to donate their time and work to make that help not only punctual but continuous. Thus, a solid network of assistance was created, initially improvised, but quickly organized into something larger and more consistent. Shelter programs were structured, offering other children what they had been denied for so long. In addition to food and physical warmth, there was now psychological support, medical assistance, educational guidance, and above all, a safe environment, where they could simply become children again. Before long, the story of the girl and the man's gesture was no longer restricted to a simple online publication or a TV report. It had become a symbol of how small individual attitudes, when moved by true empathy, can generate collective movements capable of transforming entire realities. The impact of that cold night exceeded limits, crossed neighborhoods, cities, and reached hearts that until then perhaps had never stopped to reflect on what it means, in fact, to see the other. Within this wave of solidarity, the girl, previously invisible, was now surrounded by a care she had never known. People who didn't even know his name started to care about his well-being, not out of empty charity, but because they somehow saw in it the reflection of something greater, the reminder that everyone, on some level, carries their own silent battles, and that compassion has the power to turn on lights in places that have long remained in darkness. The weeks that followed that first meeting at the bakery were filled with emotional encounters, touching testimonies, and gestures of kindness that kept pouring in from all corners. The girl, still adapting to this new reality, began to smile more often, as someone who slowly learns to trust again. The sparkle in his eyes, once faded, showed the first signs of returning, fueled now not only by warm clothes or full meals, but by something much more valuable, the sense of belonging. And even as the Christmas lights were gaining strength through the streets of the city, illuminating shop windows and squares, there was, among so many colorful decorations, a real story happening. A story that began with a simple gesture of courage in the midst of the cold of any given night, but which was already unfolding into something much bigger. The weeks that followed carried the sweet weight of transformation. What was once cold abandonment and silence now began to be filled with voices, faces, small daily gestures that, added together, built something that the girl had never experienced. Stability. The days passed at a different pace. For the first time in a long time, she didn't have to count the hours for fear of the next icy wind, nor calculate how much food she could still find on the streets. Now there were hands that guided her, gentle faces that looked at her with a new affection, and a warmth that came not only from the warm clothes, but from the simple fact of being cared for. Each morning, the girl's face seemed to take on a new contour. The gaze previously always attentive and suspicious began to relax. The small lines of tension that marked his forehead were disappearing. It was as if the whole body, after so long on alert, finally learned what rest was. Each smile that was born on her face carried, without her knowing it, the mark of a slow but steady rebirth. In the midst of this network of solidarity that was forming around her, many people began to follow her closely. There were medical visits, affectionate conversations, recreational activities and small surprises that, for her, seemed like great miracles. New notebooks, colored pencils, drawings nailed to the walls, simple objects that, in other lives, would be banal, but that for that girl represented a whole universe of novelties. Each toy received was not just a gift, but a symbol of something even greater. The confirmation that she now existed, in fact, for the world. Among so many faces that began to surround her with attention, a couple emerged who, from the beginning, followed the story with a special involvement. They were two simple people, but with immense hearts, who had long carried the dream of offering love and home to a child. They saw in that girl not a case of charity, but a strong soul who had endured more than any child should face, and who deserved finally to find a place of rest and belonging. The first approximations were delicate. There was no hurry, no empty promises, only the sincere desire to know her, to offer a constant and safe presence. Gradually, the couple began to visit her frequently. They took books, told stories, sat next to her to talk about simple things, share meals, walk through the shelter's small garden. Each meeting was a new opportunity to slowly build a bridge of trust, and each day, the distance between them narrowed. For the girl, everything was still too new. There was a subtle fear of clinging, a fear that, like everything else she had ever had, it might disappear as well. But the couple knew this and, with patience, showed her in every gesture that they were here to stay. There was no pressure, just presence. There were no demands, just affection. It was a silent care, built with the firmness of someone who understands that true affection is built in the details. As the days passed, the conversations deepened. Small walks became weekly programs. The stories read at night became comforting rituals. And so, slowly, as if learning a new language, the girl began to understand the meaning of that bond. It was no longer just physical protection, but an emotional security that until then he had never had. She began to long for those moments, to wait for those visits, to smile at the arrival of the couple. When the adoption proposal was finally put on the table, there was no rush in the response. The couple, always respectful, wanted to make sure that her heart was ready for that new step. The girl, who carried the weight of many frustrated beginnings, needed time. There were questions that echoed in his silence. What if everything fell apart again? What if the home disappeared? What if the affection ended? But little by little the answers were formed within her, not by the words of others, but by the daily gestures of love she received. When the day of the decision arrived, the girl's gaze was already different. There was a mixture of emotion and fear, but also courage. For the first time she could choose. And at that moment, with his heart beating strongly in his chest, he accepted the invitation to belong. Not as someone who is taken, but as someone who walks with his own legs towards his new home. The change was celebrated with the simplicity of heartfelt moments. The car that took her to her new home felt like a portal to a life she had never imagined. When he arrived, his eyes were lost in every detail. The door with a delicate garland, the colorful curtains, the smell of homemade food coming from the kitchen, and especially the bedroom. That room that would now be yours alone, with a soft bed, fragrant pillows, and dolls neatly arranged on a shelf. There were books stacked up, a lamp with soft light, and a closet just for her. It was more than a physical space. It was the materialization of a dream that for a long time he did not even dare to wish. The days inside that new home followed one another with an unprecedented lightness. In the morning, she woke up with the heat of the sun coming through the windows and no longer with the cold of the sidewalk. She learned how to prepare her own breakfast, tidied up her room with joy, tried on new clothes with the enthusiasm of someone who could finally choose what to wear. I discovered the pleasure of safe routines, the hot bath before bed, the stories told at the bedside, the conversations around the dinner table. The school, which once seemed like a distant universe, was now part of her new reality. With a new backpack on his back and his notebook still smelling of freshly printed paper, he walked with steady steps through the corridors full of children and teachers. The initial fear gave way to curiosity. He learned to write more confidently, read aloud, drew with increasingly colorful and precise strokes. There, among colleagues, he made shy but true friendships. She discovered the meaning of belonging, no longer as a spectator, but as a participant in life. The nights, which were once long and full of uncertainty, have become soft. Under the warm covers, with the sound of the couple's quiet breathing echoing through the house, she fell asleep, light-chested, unheaped by the weight of abandonment. Dreams have gone from being just confusing memories of hard days to becoming sweet visions of a future that now seemed possible. The couple who watched her blossom saw in this process a confirmation of everything they had wanted. The initial fear of not being able to fill her emptiness was, little by little, replaced by the joy of witnessing the rebirth of that strong girl who transformed pain into delicacy, fear into trust, and loneliness into bonds of love. While the winter, outside, took its course, inside that house a silent spring blossomed. Every little advance of hers was celebrated with restrained smiles. Every achievement was a step in the construction of a life that, for so long, had been denied to her. And so, even with the snow still falling outside, the warmth of that new home seemed capable of melting away any trace of the cold that had once dominated his steps. Even with the girl now welcomed by a new family, the man who one night reached out when everyone else fell silent did not disappear from her life. Her presence remained firm, discreet, but constant, like an invisible thread of protection that continued to envelop her even from afar. The meetings were not daily, but each visit brought with it a feeling of renewed security, a quiet certainty that if one day the world darkened again, it would still be there. There was something in his eyes that the girl always recognized, a pure care without demands, like that of someone who, no matter how much time passed, would never forget the weight of the story she once heard inside that small bakery. But as the months passed, the man's initial gesture began to turn into something even bigger. What had begun as an individual act, moved by compassion and indignation, took shape within him as a mission impossible to be contained. With each child I saw on the streets, with each story of abandonment I heard, I felt the responsibility to do more, grow. It was no longer enough to have changed the fate of a single girl. There were many other faces lost in the cold, many other voices silenced by neglect, many other looks that, like hers, begged in silence for someone to see them. That was how the seed of what would soon become his true life mission was born. With the support of friends, acquaintances, and the people who had mobilized during the wave of solidarity, he began the creation of an organization that would go far beyond a simple shelter. I didn't want to offer only food or temporary blankets, but real opportunities for transformation, reconstruction, and rescue of childhood for those who could never really live it. The organization started small, housed in a simple but purposeful building. The first children arrived shy, frightened, many of them marked by stories similar to the one the man had heard months before. Each carried its own wounds, invisible scars that required more than just food. They needed acceptance, patience, time, and above all, someone who believed in them even when the whole world had already given up. The man dedicated himself to every detail. She participated in interviews with the children, talked to psychologists and social workers, followed the school development of each one, visited the dormitories, sat in the corridors to listen to unexpected outbursts, and celebrated each small advance with the same emotion with which one day she saw the girl eat her first hot dish in that cozy restaurant. For him, every smile he regained was an immeasurable victory. Gradually, the NGO's work gained visibility. Other institutions started to support the project. Local companies offered donations. Volunteer professionals joined the team. Doctors, educators, therapists, all driven by the same desire to make a difference. The physical space expanded. The dormitories multiplied their beds. The study rooms gained new materials. Recreational activities began to fill the days with laughter and learning. Children not only survived, but rediscovered the right to dream. The impact was not restricted to the city. Other communities began to seek guidance, wanting to replicate the model. The work of that man, who one day only observed in silence the suffering of a girl in a bakery, now inspired actions in several corners. His story crossed borders, not because of the grandiosity of the initial gesture, but because of the strength of its continuity. What moved him was not recognition, but the deep conviction that no one should walk alone through the cold of indifference. And yet even with the growth of the NGO and the recognition he was beginning to receive, the man never moved away from the girl who inspired him to all that. On each visit to her house, he brought new books, small gifts, stories to share. I proudly saw the brightness that now inhabited the eyes of that child, transformed by the chance to start over. The meetings were always simple, unpretentious, but loaded with genuine affection. He didn't need to say it in words, but she knew. She would forever remain someone she could trust. The girl, in turn, understood more and more the role that this man had played in her life. She no longer saw him only as the stranger who supported her on a cold night, but as the silent angel who, with a single gesture, altered the course of her destiny. He knew that without that moment at the bakery, his story might have gone down a dark and lonely path. Now, as she played with her new friends, attended school and dreamed of the future, she carried within her the living memory of that outstretched hand when all seemed lost. At the events promoted by the NGO, it was common to see her there, walking alongside him, sometimes helping the younger children to adapt, other times telling her own story to inspire those who were still taking the first steps towards reconstruction. He had become, without realizing it, a kind of living symbol of what the organization's work represented. Proof that, no matter how great the darkness, a thread of light is enough for a new path to open up. And while the city went at its pace, with its streets full, lights flashing and the cold still trying to impose itself during the winters, there were now, scattered in different corners, small shelters of heat built by this man and his mission. They were spaces where abandonment gave way to welcoming, where fear gave way to smiles, where the silence of loneliness was replaced by children's voices regaining the right to be just children. Thus, the story that had begun with a girl in a torn blouse facing the cold now unfolded in a living current of transformation, all because a stranger that night decided not to look away. In a world where so many judge without knowing it, a single gesture of kindness can transform entire destinies. Never underestimate the power of being the one who reaches out. If this story touched your heart in any way, leave your like. It's a simple way to keep this connection we've built here alive. And if you've made it to the end, write in the comments, "I want to be an outstretched hand." It will be beautiful to see how many people carry this same desire to make a difference. He also takes the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. I always bring stories like this, which remind us of how small gestures can change everything. And look, there's a video here on the side with another beautiful story that deserves to be heard. Click and stay with me there.